Hello, water resources students. We're here today with another lecture to talk about watershed factors. The watershed factors are one of the most important things we're going to talk about this semester, maybe the most important things we're going to talk about this semester. These are the different characteristics of the watershed that determine how much of the rainfall that falls on the landscape actually ever gets translated into stream flow. Not all the water that falls as rain ever makes it in the stream. In fact, a pretty small percentage ever makes it to the stream. And if you understand the watershed factors that we're going to go over in this module and their interrelationships, you really can think your way through most watershed problems that you're going to encounter out there in the real world. So, in a lot of ways, if the only thing you remember from this course in 10 years are the watershed factors and their interrelationships, I will have probably done my job quite well as a professor. So let's get on with it. First of all, let's talk about some sources. So one of the reading assignments this week is some materials from the Stream Corridor Restoration Principles, Processes, and Practices textbook. This textbook is written by a group of people from the Federal Interagency Stream Restoration Working Group, or what I call by its initials FISRWG, FISRIG. I like the FISRIG manual for a lot of reasons. First of all, it covers the material in a way that's very applied, and that's important. And the reason that's important is a lot of the things we talk about in this class are things that people do in the real world professionally day to day, and most of that stuff has a regulatory aspect to it. This is the textbook written by those professionals who do this stuff every day, so it really focuses on the most relevant and applied aspects of the discipline. The other reason I really like this, and I think you'll like it too, is it's free. It was written by the federal government. It's put out there on a website. You can download it. All the figures are public domain. The text is public domain. So this can be freely redistributed and used. So it doesn't cost you anything for a textbook. And trust me, I could have chosen a textbook that would cost you a lot more than free. So let's go on. Okay, the sources of surface runoff. So we'll define surface runoff a little more concisely and clearly in the next slide. But for now, let's just talk about how water gets from the atmosphere to the actual surface of the earth, the top of the soil, or into the soil. Of course, some of the rain could fall directly into the stream. But the stream is actually a pretty small portion of the watershed. When you think about it, it's kind of a small target to hit. So only a very small portion of the stream of the rainfall is ever going to fall directly in the stream. The rest of it falls onto the landscape besides the stream. And a lot of that water, that rainfall water, when it falls directly onto the land surface, say onto the soil, it can be absorbed right into the soil. So every soil has a specific infiltration capacity and a rate. So every soil can absorb a certain amount of rainfall per hour. We usually would say that the maximum infiltration rate might be 2 inches per hour for this particular soil. Not all soils are the same. The soils we have here in the Ozarks tend to be very clay rich, and so they don't absorb water very well. That's one of the reasons why we have such high amounts of runoff in this area. But if you go into, say, northern Missouri, north of I-70, that's all a glaciated landscape up there. It's got really good soils. That's why they're good for agriculture. And those soils have most of those soils have really high infiltration capacities. They're much more rich in sand and loam than they are in clay, like our soils. And so those loamy soils up there, which are a mixture of silt, clay, and sand, they absorb water really well. All right. So not all soils are the same. As long as the rainfall is less than the maximum infiltration rate, so if your soil has a maximum ability to absorb water at a rate of 2 inches per hour, then if the rainfall is less than that, the soil could theoretically absorb all of it. Now, the soil can only absorb that water, though, until the soil becomes saturated. Saturation is when all the pore spaces in the soil are filled with water. At that point, the soil cannot absorb any more water until that water is able to drain out and make room for new water to infiltrate. So once the soils become saturated, you can actually think of the soil as more or less the same as concrete. Just like if rain falls on concrete, it's just going to run directly off. The concrete really can't absorb the rainfall. Neither can a saturated soil. It doesn't matter what the infiltration rate is for that soil. Once it becomes saturated, no more water can get in. Snowmelt works in a similar way to rainfall. A lot of times when you have a snowpack, now we don't experience this in southern Missouri, but in parts of the country where they get snows early in the fall and it's cold enough that those snowpacks persist through the winter, that the snowpack actually insulates the ground, and you may actually not have a lot of frozen soil under that snowpack. So as that snow melts, it may be able to just melt slowly and infiltrate right into the soil. Of course, that can only work until the soil either becomes saturated, or as long as the melt rate is less than the rate that the soil can absorb the water. Now, a special case though is if that soil underneath the snow is frozen. If the soil is frozen, then it's just like that saturated soil or concrete. If it's frozen, no more water can get in. It's unable to absorb any more water. And until you get to one of those conditions where either the infiltration capacity of the soil is exceeded, or the soil is saturated, or the soil is frozen, until you overcome one of those, really you're not going to have any overland flow across the soil. Think about this. You've probably seen a lot of rainstorms, and only in the very heaviest rainstorms do you see water that actually pools up and starts to run directly across the soil. Most rainstorms, a high percentage of the rainfall is going to just be absorbed like a sponge right into the soil. Although areas like the Ozarks tend to be somewhat of an exception to that rule, it doesn't take much for our clay-y soils to become either saturated or to overcome their infiltration capacity, so the water starts to run off pretty quickly. Now, any other water that falls from the sky that maybe lands on the tree in this figure, or the shrubs, or even the leaf litter here that's on top of the soil, or the blades of grass that are on top of the soil, or whatever vegetation's there, those are processes of interception. That means that the rainwater fell, but maybe it got held up and it's sort of pulled up on a leaf in a little depression on the leaf, or it's running down the side of the tree trunk. That would be the stem flow here. Or it falls on a leaf and then falls on another leaf and another one and eventually drips down to the ground. That would be the through-fall process that's labeled here. And then, of course, it can land on a leaf or a blade of grass that's directly on the soil, but just sit there as a droplet and not be able to reach the soil and get in. So these processes keep rainwater, some percentage of the rainwater, out of the actual soil and from flowing across the land or through the soil. Now, some of that water will eventually evaporate and go back up to the atmosphere, or it could even transpire if the roots intercept it, and then the tree takes that water up through the roots, through the leaves, and transpire. So evapotranspiration can return some of this rainfall directly back to the atmosphere. The rest of it's either going to be absorbed by the soil, or it's going to end up as overland flow. So let's just talk a little bit about surface runoff versus lateral subsurface flow. And I've got a diagram that'll help illustrate these on the next slide, but let's put the definitions here in words so you can see them. So surface runoff is precipitation, snowmelt, or we can include irrigation, where we're sort of creating artificial surface runoff that's directed towards a crop and its roots. But anyway, precipitation, snowmelt, or irrigation in excess of what can infiltrate or be stored in small surface depressions or in the soil, that will become surface runoff. So if the soil becomes saturated, then no more can infiltrate and it's going to run off. Lateral subsurface flow are things like interflow. This is the primary process where water enters the soil and then doesn't move any further vertically downward, but once it gets into the soil, it starts to move laterally, so side to side through the shallow subsurface, and then eventually returns back to the surface, usually very near to the stream, like along the banks, and then can enter the stream from there. So let's look at the next diagram, which illustrates this. So we've got our precipitation falling. Remember, we have the leaf litter here. We don't have a tree shown in this photo, but we've got the leaf litter, the ground vegetation, and so forth that can cause some interception, and those processes may either slow the water and keep it from getting into the soil longer, or totally return it back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. But the rest of that water then is either going to infiltrate into the soil and move laterally as shallow subsurface flow. And let me clarify when I say laterally here. I define laterally as side to side, but obviously in this hill slope, what we're really talking about when we say laterally is it's going to move parallel to the land surface. So parallel to the land surface on a slope means it has both a sideways and a downward vector to it, as my laser pointer and this arrow indicate here. Vertically means that it'll move through the soil, and if it moves deeper and has a primarily vertical vector, it'll percolate into the deeper earth and become part of the groundwater. It'll get to the water table and recharge groundwater. Now, some of this interflow, which here is labeled as shallow subsurface flow, moves laterally parallel to the land surface, and then will come back up. And the reason it comes back up to the surface here as it gets near the stream is often because of all this shallow subsurface flow or interflow moving towards the lowest part of the landscape, the stream, these soils right here can saturate. And because they're saturated, as more water gets pushed down this slope by gravity, it will resurface here and then run into the stream. Or what's labeled here as Hortonian overland flow, or just overland flow, or surface runoff as we're describing it in this lecture. That's where if the soil is saturated or the rainfall rate's greater than the infiltration capacity, the water's going to run over the top of the land surface and eventually get to the stream. So we can have overland flow and interflow, and both of those can sort of reemerge and join together right at the edge of the stream. And then of course, our groundwater also will eventually make its way to the stream. You can see here, as we discussed in an earlier lecture, at base flow, this is true at base flow. At base flow conditions, so your day-to-day stream flow, the surface of the water in the stream is actually the water table intersecting the ground surface. You can see the water table, this dashed line, where it intersects the land surface in the stream channel. That's what the level of flow is in the stream. Now when we get flood conditions, lots and lots of rain, the stream can actually overflow its banks, and at that point the surface of the water may not be coincident with the surface of the water table. This is more of a base flow condition phenomenon where the water table is essentially a stream. But this is important. That's why streams flow even on days when it's not raining. Even on days when it's not raining, we have some of this interflow, which is a lot slower flow process than overland flow, and groundwater flow, which can be a really slow process often. These sort of feed a steady amount of water to the stream day in and day out that maintain our base flows. So that's why we have water in the stream even when it's not raining. All right, let's sort of zoom in and take that leaf litter away from and look at the surface of the landscape here in great detail. And note that the depth of the depressions are greatly exaggerated in this figure. So they're exaggerated to make an illustration. But the soil surface is never just a smooth, straight, planar surface. There's always small, even if it's at sort of the centimeter scale or a really small sub-inch scale, there's always some little texture and topography, micro topography to that soil surface. Sometimes we have larger depressions, and sometimes these surface depressions can be quite large. But what we're really talking about here for the most part are sort of microstructures in the soil. But you can see they can capture and hold on to water and allow that water some time to infiltrate into the soil, which then means that once they're in the soil, that water will move much more slowly to the stream. This helps prevent flash floods. If all water just directly ran off on the surface and we had no soils, just say bare bedrock that couldn't infiltrate any water, every rainstorm would cause a humongous flash flood. But because we have soils, and soils both have the ability to infiltrate water and absorb it and hold on to that water and then release it slowly, and has surface depressions that can hold on to that water, help slow that water down so that it can infiltrate more effectively. We take a lot of water out of the system temporarily and cause it to move slowly, and that helps prevent flash floods. All right, so let's look at this sort of process from a scientific way. And scientifically, I mean, let's think about things as a flow chart to think about the different pathways a water droplet could take. So we have precipitation. Let's just think about one water droplet. That precipitation hits, it falls, and there's a couple things that happen. One, it could be intercepted, and that interception can result in evapotranspiration, which returns that water directly to the atmosphere, and it never infiltrates or runs off. Some of that interception will eventually make it through stem flow, through fall, whatever process, to the soil, and then it can infiltrate and it becomes soil water. And soil water then can do one of two things. It can start to move laterally or parallel to the land surface and become interflow and eventually make its way back to the stream. It can become interflow and sort of re-emerge in one of those surface detentions and then become interflow again. So notice that this arrow is two ways, and then eventually flow to the stream. And then some of that soil water could move more vertically, percolate, and become groundwater recharge. And of course, I probably should have an arrow here that shows groundwater moving back to the stream. We need another arrow here. So let's draw that in. Because remember from our last figure, some groundwater flows into the stream and maintains base flow. Now, another water particle may fall on the landscape. It could get intercepted by one of those surface detentions temporarily and then come back to the surface and flow over land, or through interflow back to the stream, or some precipitation during a really heavy storm may not ever make it to the soil because the soil is saturated and just runs directly off overland flow into the stream. So now, how much of that water then, how much of the precipitation, let's say that we have 1 gallon of precipitation, just 1 gallon to make it simple. How much of that's actually ever going to get to the stream? Well, that depends a lot on the watershed factors that we're learning about in this module. But I would say if you really press me for a number, and of course there is no right number, every watershed's different, but just as a rule of thumb or a number you can use to get your head around sort of a representative thing for all soils, if there is such a thing, is probably 68 to 80% of the precipitation that falls in the landscape either evapotranspirates back to the atmosphere or recharges groundwater. Now, I put a lot of arrows for evapotranspiration here relative to one arrow for percolation and groundwater recharge because of this water, most of that's going to end up evapotranspiring back to the atmosphere. Groundwater recharge, unfortunately, is often a pretty slow process, so it's not a huge percentage of this that ever recharges to the groundwater. That means that only 40 to 20% of precipitation ever makes it to stream flow through one of these various pathways that we went through just a moment ago. So the amount of water that ends up in the stream from precipitation is actually pretty small. And a lot of that water that ends up in the stream from precipitation takes relatively slow pathways like flow through the soil or flow through the groundwater to get back there. And it helps maintain base flow and makes our floods in most areas a lot less splashy. All right, so what are these watershed factors? We've been referring to them, but I haven't actually listed them for you. So we've got the size of a watershed. A bigger watershed obviously captures more water, but it's also got a bigger land area for all those interception processes, interflow processes, groundwater processes to intercept or to divert water from the stream. Topography. Here, if you've got a really steep watershed, it's got steep hill slopes or mountainsides, obviously gravity is going to push water faster down those slopes and may be able to overcome some of the infiltration capacity. It might be able to push that water down the slope faster than the soil can sort of capture it and infiltrate it, because the gravity becomes a more dominant force on the water. The shape of a watershed can be important. If you think about it, if you've got a watershed that, say, is linear in shape, that means that there's no place in that watershed where you're very far from a stream channel, versus if you have, say, a perfectly round circular watershed with one stream channel in it. You can think at the outside edges of that circle, you're relatively far away from the stream itself, so water has to traverse all that distance just to get to the stream, and in that time there's going to be lots of opportunity for interception, evapotranspiration, infiltration to soil water, and percolation to groundwater. In a narrow linear watershed, there's not as much time for those things to happen before the water actually finally reaches the stream. Orientation's the same way. A watershed that's oriented east and west, since most of our weather patterns, our storms usually move from west to east, a watershed oriented east to west, as that rainfall moves across the water, as that storm moves across the watershed, it actually stays on top of the watershed for a long time, which means it'll dump more rain. But think about if you've got a north-south oriented watershed and a rainstorm moving east to west across it, the actual amount of time where the rain is falling directly onto the watershed is smaller. So orientation can be a matter. Geology matters a lot. A watershed that's got lots of sandstone or has been glaciated or things like that are going to tend to have thicker soils with greater infiltration rates, versus a watershed that's got volcanic rocks or limestone, which tend to have lower permeabilities, less amount of opportunities to create infiltration. And geology, the bedrock, the geology of a watershed, the watershed's bedrock is also a key parent material that helps form soils. So the type of soil you have in the watershed is going to be a function of many things, but one of the major things is the geology of the watershed. Climate. Climate's important. Climate is how much rain we're going to expect to be delivered to the watershed on average, how heavy those storms are, how long the periods will be dry, things like that. It also influences the vegetation, the potential land uses in the watershed. And then I've underlined and boldfaced soil and land use. We're going to do a whole module on soils because soils are that important. Land use is really important too, and the reason I've got these highlighted is these are the things that humans maybe have the most influence over of all of the watershed. We can't really control the climate. We can affect the climate. We just learned about climate change, but if we could control it, we'd be able to snap our fingers with some magical technology and reverse the climate change we've caused. So we can push climate change, but we can't really control what's happening with it very well, both for physical reasons and political reasons. But just like we can't control the topography is sort of set by tectonic processes on the earth. The geology is set. We can't really change the geology of a watershed. We have some influence over the vegetation. We can't really change the aspect and orientation, but we can and we do change landscapes, land uses. I'm sitting here in the MSU campus in downtown Springfield. Obviously, when I look out my window of my office here, I see concrete, I see roofs, lots of impervious surface. We're in an urban area. This was not an urban area 200 years ago. We have changed the land use, and that has affected the amount of water that runs off. Our land use has also affected the soils. We can compact the soils, we can remove the vegetation, we can do lots of things that affect this ability of the soil to infiltrate water and hold on to it. We also sometimes remove soils. Actually, a lot of times they'll build houses, they come in and they take all the topsoil away. I think for the most part they're supposed to save that and put it on, but sometimes they sell it and leave you with sort of not so good clayey subsoil that doesn't have much infiltration capacity or ability to grow vegetation at all. So there's lots of things humans do to affect these watershed factors. And lastly, I want to point out that I got arrows going every which way here. Every one of these factors influences every other factor in some way, usually. So your soil, as I said, is a function of the geology, the climate, the topography, the vegetation that has typically been in that watershed. All of those things combine to form a unique type of soil. And then the soils are what set the stage. If you have certain types of soils, you can have certain types of land uses. Like north of I-70 in Missouri, we have a glaciated landscape with really thickly developed soils, and those are great for agriculture. So those control the land uses, and so on and so forth. I could sit here for another hour just talking about these interrelationships, but we'll do more of that in part 2 of this lecture. So that's where I'm going to stop.